at Garden Fest today to do the segment for the show, and if I can keep everything from blowing around here, we'll get started. I'm going to do a recipe called Lite Hummus today. Now, many of you have probably had hummus. It's made primarily of garbanzo beans and seasonings, and it's blended together either by hand, which doesn't happen real often here, or in a blender or a food processor. We're going to use the blender today. I'm going to start with a can of cooked garbanzo beans, also known as chickpeas. Drain them well, rinse them well, and then drain them again. Now, if a little bit of liquid gets in these, that's not going to be a big issue because we're going to add liquid to it, so it'll be okay. And most of the ingredients go in at once. I've got up to 2 cloves of garlic. You could use 1 if your garlic is a little bit sharp. You don't have to chop it really finely because it's going to go in the blender. A lot of the chopping is going to happen later. The next ingredient I have here is tahini. Now, if you've tried to buy tahini, it's somewhat hard to find and it can be extremely expensive. It's basically a sesame paste. They've ground up sesame seeds. So we have a couple of alternatives for you. If you can't get it, a relatively small jar will cost you around $10 in Stillwater, so it can be fairly expensive. You can start with a half a cup of sesame seeds in place of the tahini and then go ahead and process. You'll want to use a little bit of toasted sesame seed oil if you do that. And if you can, go ahead and toast the sesame seeds too before you put them in. And it's not quite the same, but for a lot of us that don't live in areas where we can get some of these ingredients, it'll work. Next, I've got 6 to 8 tablespoons of vegetable broth. And use a vegetable broth because this comes from a part of the world where beef broth or chicken broth wouldn't be expected. So you can either make your own or you can get the canned version. If you get the canned version, make sure you're looking for one that's got quite a bit reduced salt because some of the ingredients that we're adding here already have a fair amount of salt. Also to this, I've got 2 tablespoons of fresh lemon juice and then a small amount, half a teaspoon of extra virgin olive oil. Now, I want to add a little bit of oil to this, but in the countries where this is actually made on a regular basis, which would primarily be the Middle East, they're going to use a lot more oil. In fact, they're going to hollow out the center when they serve it, and they're going to pour in more oil. So it's a very high oil content. The sesame seeds themselves are going to add quite a bit. So we'll go ahead and start blending that up and see how well we can get it to go. You want to make this coarse, but relatively smooth at the same time. And you may have to stop the blender because these kinds of things tend to start beating only the part that's on the bottom and stir it just a little. Also gives you a chance to look at it, see how it's going. And I think we need to go a little bit further than this. Interestingly enough, the foods that come from the Middle East, we usually think of them as an amorphous kind of, everybody's eating pretty much the same thing. But when you look at the history of the food there, even though that is where probably men first began, we find that the food that they eat there is influenced internationally, just like the food that we eat here. Because of trade between nations, we see influences from China, from France, from Spain, from Africa. Many different places have gone into blending the flavors and making them the way they are today. We've got a couple of more ingredients that I want to add here. I've got a half a teaspoon of pepper. And you can always increase, decrease some of these things. I'm going to also add a half a teaspoon of salt, and you could leave that out if you chose to. And then there's one more ingredient. We'll decide in a minute how much of that we want. The last ingredient I want to put in just a couple of drops is hot sauce. And as I said, this is totally up to you whether you add it at all. And being a northerner, we're getting into 1 scant drop. I've adapted to many things here in the state and love Oklahoma dearly, but I've not quite adapted to the spicy taste. So let's see if we can stir that in a little bit and get it going a little bit better, because I don't want to be the one that gets that whole drop of hot sauce. When you get this done, you want to keep it in the refrigerator covered tightly. It will last for several days. I'm going to serve it today with pita squares or pita chips. Simply pita bread that I took and cut in half. It was pita pockets, cut them in half horizontally and then cut them into wedges and put them in the oven at 375 for about 8 to 10 minutes until they're toasted. Now, as I said, this is how we would probably serve it here. You could also serve it with fresh vegetables. and we're going to sprinkle a little bit of chopped parsley on the top. Now, if you were having this in the Middle East, they would probably make a well there in the center and pour more olive oil into it. And it's also very good that way, but we're trying to lighten it up just a little bit. I hope you'll give this one a try. It's Lite Hummus. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.